In this final segment, we're taking a look at part 3, or problem number 5. As you actually see it in a moment, it's going to say it's problem number 1. It said problem number 1 on your exam, but it's actually the 5th problem in the sequence. So let's take a look at this. So I'm suggesting that we know the labor demand curves are downward sloping, labor supply curves are upward sloping, and that some set of labor supply and demand equations gives us a great deal of information about a particular labor market. So suppose that you've been told that a competitive market exists with the labor supply relation of 68 minus 2W, labor demand relation of 68 minus 2W, which is the same that you saw in a couple of the other problems, but now a labor supply of 8 plus 4W. So demand of 68 minus 2W, supply of 8 plus 4W, where W equals thousands of wage in income per week. So whatever our W is going to be multiplied by 1,000, and that gives us income per week. That's an important point here. But that L equals number of workers. So provide the following based on this information. The first thing I ask you to do is give me a properly labeled and articulated model. And I'm looking for all the various points here. I was pleased that so many of you not only gave me some of the basic points, but also gave me employer surplus, worker surplus, total surplus. That was good. And you did that for representing for another part of this. But I thought that was good. So we've gone ahead here, and we then set our intercepts. As we know how to do those. To set the intercepts, we're going to think about labor demand at 68 minus 2W. Well, if that's labor demand is equal to 0, then we have 0 equals 68 minus 2W, or 2W equals 68, or W equals 34. And if we have W at 0, then we have labor demand equals 68 plus or minus 2 times 0, or 0, so LD is simply 68. If we're looking at labor supply of 8 plus 4W, then we know if LS is equal to 0, then we have 0 equals 8 plus 4W, or 4W equals negative 8, or W equals negative 2. We also know that if wage is equal to 0, then we have LS being equal to 8 plus 4 times 0 is 0, so LS is just equal to 8. So what are we looking at here? Well, we've got the wage of 34, labor of 68 for the labor demand relation, but we have then for the labor supply curve a wage of negative 2, so we've extended into negative space a wage of negative 2, and a labor of 8 on the labor axis. So this actually gives us a slightly different looking model than we've looked at before, and we have to think later on about the interpretation of that. So we have 34, 68, 8, labor supply, labor demand. Now we can equilibrate these, of course. When we equilibrate them, we're going to end up with 68 minus 2W is equal to 8 plus 4W, or 68 will equal, or 6W will equal 10. 6W will equal 60. And W star will be equal to 10. We then take that W star, and plug that into either of our equations. I'm plugging it into labor supply here. 8 plus 4 times 10 is 48, so that's our L star. Okay, so here I've given you the values for the intercepts, just as I've worked them out for you up here. So this is our beginning model. Now, if you're giving me everything you can about this, you now know how to calculate employer surplus. Employer surplus is going to be this area. And we know that that'll be 34 minus 10 for the height, and then 48 for the width. So 34 minus 10 for the height times 48 for the width, divided by 2 because it's a triangle. So employer surplus of 576. Worker surplus is a little bit different. We use a different pen to show this. Worker surplus will be the area below the wages being paid. And worker surplus is truncated at the zero bound now. We don't go into a negative territory because there frankly isn't anything such as negative workers or really a wage, especially a wage that's negative. We don't go beyond the zero bound for worker surplus. So in this case, we have to think about this as a rectangle and a triangle. And the rectangle is going to be 10 minus, or it's going to be a height of 10, a base of 8, so that's going to be 80, so 8 times 10. And then the triangle will be, again, a height of 10, so 10 minus 0. And now a base of 48 minus 8, and then that divided by 2. And so that together, those values are going to give us 280. This was 80, this was 200, it gives us 280. And so 280 on top of 576, so employer surplus and worker surplus gives us a total surplus of 856. So you could have given me all of that here, and the more information you gave me, the more points you received. So now I'm asking you to describe the labor market resulting from these equations in as much detail as you can. Be sure to include information regarding the reservation wage, level of unemployment, relative skill level of workers in this market. So those are all important. So I want the reservation wage. I want something about unemployment, relative skills, any other interesting issues that you can think of arising from this market. Well, that would clearly include maybe something about W star, which meant that W star, think about how we think about wages here, told me that it's $10,000 a week or $520,000 a year. I think that's pretty highly skilled, by the way. I don't know many people that make that kind of money that are low-skilled workers or even moderately skilled workers. I don't know any of them, as it turns out, that are low or moderately skilled. They're all highly skilled workers that have that kind of wage earning. We know that there's 48 workers. That's a relatively low value. Don't know how important that is, but it's a low value. The reservation wage was kind of interesting, though. The reservation wage is -2. Well, let's stop to think about what that really means. In this market, it doesn't mean that workers are working for -2 necessarily. The workers in this market that are in the market, that are being paid in the market, they're working for 10 or 10,000 a week, 520,000 a year, and there's 48 of them. But with this reservation wage all the way down here at -10, that means that there might be workers that would be willing to supply their labor at -2. This is the labor supply curve, right? So -2, there's some worker that at anything above -2, some worker would be willing to supply their labor. Well, what might this be? This might be a market that has such a compelling market level of wage that people would be willing to start into it with maybe internships, or maybe they're aspiring actors or vocalists or musicians that if they're really involved in this market, they're being hired in this market, they're making some fairly good money, and there's not very many of them, right? Musicians, artists, actors, vocalists, etc. There's not very many of them, and so they might break into the market at a negative wage. They're volunteering. In fact, they're actually going around singing, doing their artistry, acting, probably in community theaters. They're not getting paid. In fact, it costs them. So they start into the market, or they're willing to supply some labor, but if they are really then part of the market and they're hired by some firm, they're getting a strong wage at this equilibrium wage, but they are willing to break into it at some negative value. And at a wage of 0, apparently there's 8 people that are willing to supply their labor at a wage of 0. Although if they're actually working, of which 48 are, they're getting 10,000 a week or 520,000 a year. So that's kind of interesting. That tells about the reservation wage. There is no unemployment in this market. Well, how do I know that? Because labor supply equaled labor demand. So all workers that wanted to work at the going wage are working. The firms demanded them. The market supplied them. There is no unemployment in the market. There must be very highly skilled workers, as I indicated, and then we've already calculated the values of employer surplus, worker surplus, and total surplus. So you could have told me all of those things. You could have told me perhaps, if you understand elasticity, as some of you might, you could have told me that these are workers that probably have a relatively low relatively inelastic labor demand. You might have told me that with such high skills, they're probably not very easily substitutable. So you could have told me a lot. You might have even been able to tell me more than this. There wasn't just one right answer to this, but if you gave me some goodly combination of these, 4 or 5 of these items, then you received all the points for this. Some of you gave me only 1 or 2 of these, leaving off some very rich detail. Some of you completely misunderstood the reservation wage, in fact, misrepresented the reservation wage on the graphic. But I was looking for some combination of this information, and the more you gave me that was accurate, the more points you got. And this part was worth 10 points because there's so much that you could have put into it. So then I ask you a relatively general question. Why are labor demand curves downward sloping? Well, labor demand curves are downward sloping really for just one reason, because of the law of diminishing marginal productivity. So if I think about it, here's my labor demand curve. I've got a wage. I've got a quantity of labor. Well, if the more workers I hire, the lower the marginal product of labor is. We've shown that numerous times within the course so far. If that's the case, then the productivity goes down. I would want to pay them a lower wage. So the number of workers goes up, the wage goes down because the productivity is going down. That's why demand curves are downward sloping. So then I ask you the question, why are labor supply curves upward sloping? Well, there's a number of reasons. You can approach this from 2 ways, but there's one of these that's critical to this. So labor supply curves are upward sloping because it requires a higher wage to get a worker to exchange yet more leisure for their wage. Think about it. In order to get a wage, we're exchanging leisure for some labor that we then sell to the marketplace for the wage. So it's really, we're getting paid to exchange leisure. Also, as the labor units decrease, or as labor hours decrease, what happens to the leisure hours? Well, they also decrease. In fact, as labor hours are rising, then leisure hours are becoming increasingly scarce. As labor hours rise, leisure becomes increasingly scarce. So labor supply curve, if you're wanting me to exchange an increasingly scarce commodity, my leisure, you must have to pay me yet more to get me to do it. You must pay me more to motivate me to do that. So I was looking for some combination of just indicating that you need to motivate workers, and that as the number of labor hours increases, that leisure time becomes increasingly more scarce. And that's the answers to number 5.